So look, welcome everybody, and thank you for your interest. It's been quite a good quite a good turnout, and we're getting a few more people coming along as we go. So I'll try and chew gum and walk at the same time when it comes to that, and hopefully we get everyone in the room. So I'll share my screen. And I'll hopefully rely on Tui to tell me that that's there. You can see that okay?
Pete.
Beautiful. Thank you. Righto, guys. So thanks for joining us. And what we want to do today is give you a bit of a high level view of what's coming next Tuesday with the release of the December ABVs. There's been quite a lot going on. I'd nearly say over the last 2 years in this space in terms of the changes that are all going to flow through in December, and there's potentially was even some more changes that we could have made that where will probably trickle out over time, just given the volume of stuff that was going to happen in December and the impact it was going to have. So it's probably best to limit these things to a concise group of changes that people can wrap their minds around. So what are we going to expect in December? The big ticket item are the outcomes. We're implementing the outcomes of the NBO work that we've been doing, and this is the piece that's probably been going on for nearly 2 years. And that really is updating our BPI, HWI and SI, so our national breeding objectives, the things that drive profit and genetic progress in our industry have all been updated. Another thing that we've done is we've updated our base, and that's been a bugbear for many people for a long time, and the sticking issue around updating our base has been issues around type and type expression and setting of the type base, and we've been able to work through those issues, and that's allowed us to update the base and probably start to implement a regular update of the base. There's a new survival model that we've implemented, and that's been based on the work done by Majid Khansafit and a group of researchers at Dairy Bio. And that's an interesting piece of work that's going to give us a better indication of an animal's productive life. We've got a new expression for type traits with intermediate optimums. So type traits where the desirable breeding values sit somewhere in the range of breeding values, not at either end. Farmers are often used to selecting for the extreme, or selecting to the bars that all go to the right. That doesn't necessarily give them the outcome that they need or desire. So we've looked at a range of traits where the optimum sits somewhere in the range of breeding values, and we're identifying where those optimums are now to give farmers more visibility of what they should be breeding for or aiming for. And finally, we've improved our single step model for red breeds. And so we went to the single step model a couple of years ago for reds, and that's been a great piece of work, but there's some little hitches that we've had along the way, and we've ironed those out, and we're introducing those changes in this run as well. So, there's 5 big ticket items there that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so what to expect with the changes to the NBO update? We're going to see some changes in the rankings of animals and their breeding values, and that's going to that's going to be fairly obvious, I think, when you see the breeding values. I mean, it it impacts different bulls differently, and obviously there'll be some winners and losers. But one thing we will also see is bigger values for BPI, HWI, and SI, and that's due to the change in the economic model that we're using to calculate these three indices. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. The base update, as most people that have been involved in the industry for a while would understand, that a base update generally means a reduction in most breeding values. And that's the case for production ABVs, certainly for fertility in Holsteins, and generally smaller changes to the ABVs of most other traits. The difference here is type ABVs actually go up, and that's because we've redefined the base. So we'll talk about that as we go along. The new survival ABV will also have an influence on some animal rankings. So there's some bulls that benefit from the change. There are some bulls that don't benefit from the change. However, the good thing about the new survival ABV is it's a better estimate of the productive life of animals. So it's a step in the positive. It's a step in the right direction. Where are we at now? So as I mentioned, the intermediate optimum traits, we're going to be able to more easily identify animals with optimum ABVs and hopefully provide some advice on breeding in the right direction. And that I think that's something that's been lost over the years for some traits. And we can see that with the direction some of these traits are taking. And of course, this improved single step for red breeds, which will cause some change in animal rankings for reds. Probably more so imported bulls than domestic bulls, although any change, any son of an imported bull, that change will flow down through to that locally bred son. Okay, let's start with the NBO. So our process around the NBO hasn't changed, and this is back when we did our first National Breeding Objective Review, which was back around 2015. We used this approach of making sure that we had industry consultation, we looked at farmer priorities, and we had rigorous scientific and economic review. And so it's not just about saying, well, this is what the science says and this is what's good for you, so suck it up and this is what you're going to get. It's about making sure that that fits with farmer priorities and it all makes sense, and it means that we're all pulling in the one direction. And the reason we need to review it is because, as it says there, our breeding objectives need to evolve as farming systems and profit drivers change. And there's no doubt over the past 5 years, there's been some changes in that space. And the changes that we're implementing with this NBO review reflect those changes. So the three things that are impacted the most by the NBO review are the three things that drive our farm profitability, and they are from a genetic sense, and they're the BPI, the HWI, and the SI. So you'll see some different rankings of bulls and some different numbers in this space when we see the new indexes next Tuesday. It's been quite a process, and some of you that have seen some of these presentations before have had presentations at different stages of this. And it started all the way back in April 24 when internally we basically cobbled together what we felt were the pain points out there in the industry, the things that were that had changed, the things that were causing annoyance, all those sorts of things. And that started the process. And then we got into the consultation with the survey work. and then did the heavy lifting around creating the economic models to underpin all this. We spoke to industry again. We ended up having discussions with more stakeholders, including the Genetic Evaluation Standing Committee. And now we're just in the last few months, we've been doing the work to implement all this. So the work that goes on behind the scenes, all the computer reprogramming, all that sort of stuff has all been happening. And the testing, I've got to say, the testing has been very rigorous. We've had to do a number of test runs, and as some of you would know, we even cancelled a routine run in order to make sure that we were 100% confident that what we were going to implement next week is on the money, and we are confident about that. So there's internally for us, there's a lot of big changes here. You may not see them necessarily externally, but there's some big changes internally, and we need to be confident that we're getting it right. One of the big things that you will see a change in externally is around milk pricing, and this is the one thing that really impacts on the three key indices. So through this process, or previously in this process, we used the 5-year historical rolling average milk price in our models. And that's reasonably safe because it's historical, so you know it. But we felt that, what we're breeding is tomorrow's animals, not yesterday's animals. And so we needed to think forward about when these animals are going to hit the herd. And most of the animals that are going to be bred using these indexes are going to hit the herd in, 2028, 2029 and onwards. So using an historical milk price is not quite going to hit that mark, we didn't think. So we've shifted to using the current year milk price plus 4 years projected milk price in our model. The big change there is in the balance of protein to fat ratio has gone from 2:1 to 1:1. So, that will have an impact on bulls that were predominantly, hello, I'm in the waiting room. How's that? Let's admit that and see if it messes anything up. So the big change here in doing that is those bulls that have predominantly got towards the top of the list because of their extreme protein, and they're probably bulls that have had breeding values like 40 kilos of protein and 20 kilos of fat. They're the ones that are probably impacted the most, and I'm sure some of the bull company people online would have already maybe had the heads up as to which of those bulls are going to get impacted. The other thing we did was update in the model, obviously feed, input and labour costs, and to do that we had to project those as well. And we've kept those costs in line with milk price. So as milk price has gone up, so have feed, input and labour costs. And we think that just makes sense because we don't recall in any part of our history where, milk price goes up and the other input costs stay static. Oftentimes it's the other way around. Milk price goes down and input costs keep going up. So we felt the sensible approach was to keep those input costs at the same ratio to the current milk price. So what did we base this on? We did a lot of work with the Fresh Agenda Everag group, so Steve Spencer and Joe Bills, and they did a very thorough, comprehensive review of where they felt milk price was heading, and also farm input costs. And as you can see from that graph there, the protein, their projection is the protein-based products, so your skim milk powder and whey, are into the future going to pretty much flatline in terms of returns, but your more fat-based products such as butter and cheese are going to go up in terms of price. And so what that's done is translated into a change in that fat to protein ratio where, we were up towards 2 to 1, back prior to 2020. And now our projection is we're going to be getting into more like 1.2 or 1 to 1. So, that's effectively what we've based this decision on. And like I say, it's the one thing that really impacts on the bull rankings more so than anything. The other decision we made was to make, and the HWI, I suppose we've always pitched the HWI as an index for seasonal calving farmers. But what we've done is we've actually tried to increase the seasonal focus in the HWI, and we've done that by adding in calving ease and gestation length. And whilst they don't have a massive impact, we feel that it's a common sense thing to do, as they are really important traits in the HWI that sit alongside the heavy emphasis that we have on fertility. So I think that's a positive step forward for the HWI. So a bit of internal banter. We're generally not necessarily fans of these pie charts internally because they only tell you part of the story. They're a nice way of comparing where we've been and where we're going. Probably a more accurate way, and we'll touch on this in a minute or two, is to look at response to selection, because the percent emphasis graphs don't always tell the full story. But in this case, they're going to tell us some important changes between our old indices and our new indices. And as I said, the important change in the BPI is that fat to protein ratio. And you can see in the old BPI, we were more 21% protein and 15% fat. Now it's kind of flipped to 15 and 24. So milk has gone down a little bit in terms of relative emphasis compared to where it was also. Now, the key thing about all this is the proportion of production in the BPI is still the same. It sits at about 46%. So when we start to look at the other traits that make up the BPI, such as survival, fertility, cell count, mastitis resistance, temperament's probably gone down a little bit, type's probably gone up a little bit. But by and large, those traits haven't changed that much in the new BPI. And that's why I kind of say to people, the thing that's going to drive change in bull rankings is that shift in fat to protein ratio. HWI, we see the same sort of thing. Again, a change in that fat to protein ratio. Production only making up around 30% of the HWI. You can see the inclusion of gestation length and calving ease up here, which together make up about 2% or a little bit more. So they're not having a huge influence. But by and large, the other traits that contribute to HWI have stayed roughly the same. A little bit more emphasis on fertility in the new HWI at the expense of maybe a little bit of type. So again, it's kind of the same beast, but the big ticket item is that change in fat to protein ratio. And exactly the same thing going on with SI. As we know, the SI is probably the most production-focused index because we're looking at emissions intensity, and one of the best ways to bring down emissions intensity is to drive up production per cow or per unit, and dilute the carbon that those cows produce. And so therefore, it's a more production-focused index. But again, it's going to be a little bit more focused on fat than it has been on protein, with the other half of the index made up by all the things that effectively keep cows in the herd. I don't know what's going on there. So here's another way of looking at the trait emphasis across the three indices. to get maybe a better comparison between the three of them. As most of you would be aware, ASI is a measure of production, so it's our protein plus fat minus milk index. And ASI in HWI has always been a little bit lower because it has that higher emphasis on non-production traits, especially in this case, fertility. And you can see that in the brown bar in the middle of the fertility group there. By and large, everything else is kind of, roughly the same. The difference in terms of other traits is in the minimal basket. Feed saved a little higher in SI, type a little higher in BPI. If we go to the response to selection, you can sort of see the trade-offs that have been made here between the current BPI, or the old BPI we call it, and the updated BPI. So if we look at the big ticket items here, we can see that we're going to get a little bit more emphasis on fat than we have before, a little bit more genetic gain for fat if you're using the BPI, and a little bit more genetic gain for protein. Sorry, not protein, survival. And a little bit less for protein. So this is why I say, we sometimes look at those pie charts and we sort of go, oh, that looks a bit funny. This is really where the rubber hits the road, is when we look at response to selection. And it kind of looks like maybe the protein trade-off is really, really big, but because of the way traits are correlated, the trade-off in protein, or what we're giving away in protein in this index, is not as big as what people might expect. But we are gaining a fair bit more fat. And that's pretty much because fat and protein are positively correlated and they come along together. So that's where the looking at response to selection is maybe a little bit better way of explaining how the index is going to impact you than maybe just looking at those pie charts. You can sort of see for other traits like fertility and cell count, not a lot of difference. Mastitis resistance just a wee bit lower, carving ease a wee bit higher. But look, for all intents and purposes, the rates of genetic gain for those traits over the next 10 years are not going to be impacted greatly by the changes we're making. Okay, updating the base. So the base has always been a contentious issue, and if you talk to geneticists, it's probably one thing that they really hate is the base, because you get the glib response, well, just set it where you like. But that's not necessarily helpful for industry-facing people like myself in particular. What we've done now in this instance is we've made some changes to the way we define the base. And that big change is around including all animals in the genetic evaluation system born in those particular selected years are now making up the base. So our base for cows, for traits where we use cows as a base, is now going to be 2020 plus or minus 2 years. Our base as of back in August was 2011 plus or minus 2 years. So there's a bit of a jump there. What we are, and where including all the animals comes into play, is for traits like workability and type, where in the past we only used animals with phenotypes. Okay, so we were only using animals that had been evaluated, not as ICAR recommends, including all animals that have entered the genetic evaluation system. We'll talk about that a little more in a minute, especially with reference to type. The other change that we're making is we're going to commence 5-yearly base rolls. So, in line with, say, what they do in the US and some other countries, we're going to roll the base every 5 years. It's going to happen this December. It will happen again in another 5 years' time. So that's a commitment we're making. So what's the impact? as I said earlier, ABVs for traits like production, fertility, survival will generally go down, and that reflects genetic gain. So it's it's often seen as a negative because those breeding values come down, but really it's a reflection of the genetic progress that we've been making. And we've made good progress for production, fertility in Holsteins in particular, and survival in general have all benefited from the genetic gain that we've made over that 9-year period, and the consequence of that is, in general, those breeding values are going to go down. ABVs for type will go up because we're going to be comparing to all cows, not just this highly selected group. And it doesn't have an impact on animal rankings because when we roll the base, we take the same amount off each breeding value off each animal. So it doesn't, everyone drops by 100 litres of milk, or everyone drops by 3 points of fertility, or whatever the roll is. And so it doesn't adversely affect one animal more than another animal. It impacts all animals in the same way. And so therefore it doesn't actually have an impact on animal rankings. So what are the base changes that are coming for production traits and other key traits? And again, we can see this if you want to, be half glass empty about this. You can look at this as a bad thing, or you can celebrate it. Or you can look at it as a celebration of genetic gain. If we look at what's going on in Holsteins, and it's interesting to compare probably the Holsteins and the Jerseys in this space. Holsteins haven't made as much genetic gain for protein over that period of time as the Jerseys have. So well done, Jerseys. You've made, over double the genetic gain as Holsteins have in protein. Genetic gain for fat for both breeds has been roughly the same. For milk, Holsteins haven't made much genetic gain. So in fact, that's an interesting case because obviously if you don't make as much gain for milk, your percentages are going up. So that's a good thing. Jerseys overall for production, though, have made a lot of genetic gain, and they've made 200 litres of milk genetic gain, and unfortunately that's one thing that's going to impact Jerseys is they're going to lose 200 litres off their milk ABVs. So we haven't been able to make all of this palatable for everybody. And I know especially some of the bull companies that are exporting Jersey genetics, that base change for Jersey milk is not going to be a help. It's going to be more of a hindrance. But you can't pick and choose which traits you're going to roll the base for. It's either all or nothing. We can sort of see that there's been good genetic gain for cell count across the Holsteins and Jerseys, good genetic gain for survival. This is the interesting one, I think, is the focus that the Holstein breed has been putting on fertility in that period of time has meant that the Holstein fertility base is going to roll by about 6 points. In contrast, the Jerseys are not going to roll at all for fertility. And I suppose, when we think about it, that negative correlation between production and fertility, if your focus has been on production, you probably haven't been making as much genetic gain on fertility. Now that may well change going into the future, but that's just the way it's been to this point. Let's talk about the tricky subject of type. And I mentioned this a couple of times as we've gone along. What we're doing now is comparing to the whole population. In the past, what we were doing was comparing to a highly selected elite group. So as I mentioned, our base previously used to be animals that had classification scores. So if we think about that for a minute, these are animals that are either predominantly in registered herds or GINFO herds, or animals that have been picked up by the bull companies through the LTE process. And those animals have generally been the daughters of their better bulls. So we've created a bias in the group of animals that we've been using to set the base for type. And those animals in general have had higher classification scores, they've had better udder traits, and they've also been taller as a group. They've also had shorter teats, shallower bodies, and narrower chests than the whole population. So they weren't really a great reflection of what the average cow was out there. But what it meant was we were comparing all of our animals, both cows and bulls, to a very high standard. And so that's why when we roll the base for type, numbers go up, because now we're comparing to a lower standard. So one of the big things that happens in this space is probably in the type and mammary system area for Holsteins and Jerseys, where type proofs are actually going up by around 4 points. So your bull that's currently at 100 is going to be 104. Mammary systems, even more movement. So we're going to see, jumps in mammary systems. So, some bulls that have probably been regarded as unmarketable before are really, going to move into a marketable space. And don't forget that's been compared to the average cow born in 2020. So this is a positive step forward, I think. You can see that stature in Holsteins goes up, which is a little unfortunate because I think everyone's trying to pull the stature down, but that's just a simple reflection of the fact that the cows in the old base were a lot taller than the cows in the new base, and the new base is more reflective of the whole population. So, I think that's that can be seen as, as a positive or a negative. And you can see also udder traits change dramatically as well, with a lot of the udder traits going up. So, bar graphs in general are going to look a whole lot more attractive, especially in the Holstein and the Jersey breed. And that's got to be a good thing for marketing genetics, I would think. Let's talk about the survival model. And as I said earlier, this has been a lot of work by the likes of Majid and the crew at Dairy Bio. And the outcome for us, and I mean, we can kind of summarize it by saying, hey, it predicts survival better, which kind of seems like underselling the amount of work that has been done in this space, because it's been years of work to create this better model that includes early and late survival as two different traits. And that's because they're different beasts, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the new ABV is more predictive. It's got more data behind it. And like the old ABV, it has an average of 100. So 105 means you're going to be 5% better at survival than a bull at 100. So what's the difference here? We've looked at survival as early and late survival. So we're treating them as effectively two traits. We join it together at the end of all this and turn it into one trait so that it doesn't add too much confusion out there in the marketplace about, should I be selecting for early survival or late survival? The reality is you should be selecting for survival. But by splitting it, it's giving this model more power. And so we've looked at what affects an animal's chances of survival in that first lactation, and then we've combined that with what helps an animal survive in the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth lactations. We've also added to that some predictor traits like pin set and udder depth, which we know have a positive correlation with survival. And in the process, we've also been able to use termination codes to better identify why animals have been leaving the herd. So overall, this is giving us a better relationship between our predicted survival and the actual survival of animals. What's really interesting in this is just the differences between early survival and late survival. And especially when we look at Holsteins here and we look at the influence of production. So these orangey yellow lines, sorry about my colour blindness, but those ones there, if you can see where my pointer is for production traits, protein yield and milk yield, you can see that early survival, so survival in that first year in Holsteins, is reasonably well correlated with production. That's great. It's also correlated with very highly correlated with fertility. The interesting thing is, though, when we look at later survival in Holsteins, the production traits don't seem to be influencing later survival that much. And I suppose, in a practical sense, what that's telling us is if a Holstein heifer gets through its first lactation, its production is not really considered as a culling, as a point of culling from there on in. So it gets through its first lactation, and therefore it's going to be other things that take her out of the herd other than production. And some of those things are obviously going to be things like fertility, somatic cell score, and udder depth are going to be influences on her later survival, more so than production. If we look at Jerseys, though, it's a different story, and that's why we need to split this up by breed and look at what drives survival in not only from an early or late sense, but also from a breed sense. And you can see that even though with late survival, production isn't as highly correlated as in Jerseys as it is with early survival, it still has quite a strong correlation. And I suppose that kind of fits in with the genetic progress that Jerseys have been making as well, and why the base rolls for some of those for protein and milk in the Jersey breed are a little higher than what they are in the Holstein breed, because there's been greater emphasis from Jersey breeders on the production side of things. Yeah, so this kind of new model is going to give us a lot more predictive power when it comes to identifying animals that survive longer in the herd. And as I say, it's a better indicator of overall productive life of the animal, as opposed to what our old survival was, which was really the chance of reappearing next year. So that's a key point. Just in terms of what the impact of the change is, when we look at the change between old survival and new survival in Holsteins, the standard deviation is a little over 2.6 points. So that's in round terms, that means around 2/3 of our bulls are going to change by less than plus or 5 ABV points. However, the more extreme bulls are going to change by around 8 survival points. So some bulls will be affected fairly heavily by the change, but by and large, most bulls are going to, a point here, point there, a few up around 3, 4, 5 points. And then that obviously has a flow-on effect into our 3 key indices. The magnitude of the change in Jerseys was a little bigger. It was 3.4, so you can kind of work out from that it will have a little bit more of an impact in Jerseys, but not substantially more. Okay, let's talk about IO type traits, or intermediate optimum type traits. And these are type traits where breeding for a midpoint is the desirable breeding goal, as opposed to breeding for the extreme. And rear teat placement is a good example of this, where we want teats placed centrally on the udder, not right under the udder. And our breeding direction for rear teat placement over many, many years has been strongly in in that direction. So this is a classic example of the bar being out to the right, people seeing that as being good. In fact, it's actually been detrimental. So this, I think, is an important piece of work to try and address that and maybe turn the ship around, although I think it's going to be a very big task for some of these traits. So which traits are we talking about? There's probably more traits that could be described as intermediate optimum traits than this set here. So pin set, rear leg set, bone quality, udder depth, and the two teat placement traits. To that, you could add stature when you look at the different class systems, and you could add teat length, there's being an optimum teat length. The reason we didn't include stature in all of this is because we feel stature becomes more of a personal preference in terms of where farmers want to pitch things for stature. And we know clearly, and we see that from the base roll stuff, that there's a clear difference between, the attitude towards stature in registered herds and the bulk of other herds. So we've left stature to the choice of the farmer. The other trait, as I mentioned, could be teat length, where there is really an intermediate optimum. But given the bulk of the population is probably more erring on the short side than the long side, and we know the level of frustration that creates, we've left teat length alone because, as a general rule, longer is going to be better. And I'm not sure that too many farmers are going to be breeding cattle with teats that are too long. So why don't you just make 100 the middle? Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. So why don't we just make 100 for pin set in Holsteins, the point that we're aiming for? Because what's been happening over time through selection, and that can be just because of inadvertent selection. So we're selecting for, one thing and other things are coming along with it. So, traits like production traits don't usually get, I suppose, positive primary selection in a lot of cases. So if we're selecting for fertility or we're selecting for production, it's going to come with bulls that have different traits, and so you can get dominant bloodlines, that sort of thing, dragging the population off into a particular direction because there's no corresponding selection for those traits that are going to drag it in the opposite direction. So over time, populations kind of ebb and flow and drift, and I think we're seeing some of that with some of these type traits. Also, trait correlations, and a good example of that is, and I said this to an old colleague a few days ago, that when we first entered the industry, there were a lot of cows that had very wide front teats, and there was a bull called Roybrook Starlight was all the rage, and sometimes his daughter's udders could look like magnetic mines with things poking out in all directions. So a lot of work was done to drag in front teats, and front teat placement and rear teat placement are positively correlated. So the consequence of that is you drag in the front teats, you drag in the rear teats as well, and there's not a lot of room in those between the back legs of a cow for those teats. So, there's some inadvertent things going on there, and obviously there's breed differences as well. So unfortunately, not all traits just have a nice, simple intermediate optimum that aligns with an ABV of 100. So we have, for each breed, we have different intermediate optimum breeding values and ranges. So just looking at the Holsteins, and the Holsteins is probably the most problematic breed in this space because there's two traits, pin set and rear teat placement, that are quite skewed in the population. So the intermediate optimum range for pin set in the Holsteins is between 107 and 114, which is quite high. On the other end, optimum teat placement sits somewhere between 85 and 93. So, and I know Pete Williams has been saying this for a number of years now, don't think 100 is the right teat placement breeding value for rear teats in Holsteins, because it's not. It's much lower than that. And the piece of work that's been done here indicates that it sits somewhere between 85 and 93. So bulls with those breeding values will have an O next to their breeding value. If you fall into that range, and unfortunately for Holsteins in rear teat placements, there's not a lot of them, because most bulls are probably sitting on the close side of things rather than the optimum or even wide side of things. If we look at jerseys and we look at pin set, it's quite different. A very different story, where the optimum range is somewhere between 97 and 104. So, 100 for pin set is probably not it probably lines up in the Jersey breed, whereas it certainly doesn't line up in Holstein. So 100 for pin set in Jerseys is optimum. 100 for pin set in Holsteins is high. So you've got to tailor this to each breed, and it's how the breeding values relate to the animals in the population that we're trying to identify here. And again, in the Jerseys, the rear teat placement is nowhere near as extreme as what it is in the Holsteins, where the optimum is sitting in that 97, 98, 99 space. The Reds look a little bit more like the Holsteins, where the optimum for pin set is higher than 100, and the optimum for rear teat placement is lower, but nowhere near as extreme as what it is in the Holstein breed. So what does all this mean? When we look at the likes of Datavat and some of our Excel reports we're going to be putting out, you'll see a letter code that follows the breeding value of the animal. And in this instance, for pin set, this particular bull is 94 for pin set, so we're indicating that he is going to leave higher pin daughters. Rear leg set, he's 101, so he's outside the optimum range, so he's going to be curved. But bone quality for this bull is in the optimum range, so he'll have an O next to his breeding value. Udder depth is more on the extreme side, so very shallow udders, so he'll have an S. In this instance, front teat placement is going to be wide, rear teat placement is going to be close. Obviously, we want both of those in that with an O rather than a W or a C, but that's just the way it falls. So what we've come up with, I hope, is a more descriptive system as to where the breeding direction for these traits is going to is going, and give farmers a little bit more to think about when they're selecting their bulls, especially for important traits like pin set, udder depth, and teat placement. And finally, we've updated the red breed single step model, and this is something we've been working on for a number of years. The tricky thing here for us is the integration of MACE breeding values, so data from overseas. It's a bit of a world first for us, in terms of integrating the overseas breeding values with our domestic conventional breeding values and genomics. And that's something that hasn't been done in other countries yet, and we've been the first to do it. Our previous model we were using was overestimating production, especially protein. And we've come up with a better way of handling protein and production traits in this new model. But as a consequence of that, we're going to see a reduction in breeding values for some overseas bulls, especially around protein, and to a lesser extent, the other production traits. And as I said earlier, that has the propensity to flow through to sons of those bulls that might have been bred domestically, and obviously their sons from overseas as well. So there'll be a little bit of a reshuffling of the Australian Reds, or the red breed group, based on this upgraded integration of the MACE into the single step model. So on top of the changes from the NBO and the base and survival. The red group's also going to get a model change as well, which will create a little bit more movement. Okay. That's been quite a bit for you guys to take in all in one session. And the good thing is, for you is there's a whole lot of updated learning resources around these things. So fact sheets and tech notes, all of those that have been impacted by these changes have been updated. So if you're interested in survival, there's a tech note there on survival. There's also a genetics backgrounder for type, and that explains, I'd like to think in a pretty reasonable way, everything that all the changes we've made around the base and also around the intermediate optimum type traits. So you can get access to all of those resources on the DataGene website and just go to learning resources, and you can trawl your way through the myriad of tech notes and fact sheets and the handful of genetics backgrounders that are there on the topics of your choice. But if some of the stuff needs clarifying, that's not a bad place to start. The other place is drop me an email or give me a call or any of our team, and we can help walk you through some of the trickier parts of these changes that we're making. Or if you want a bit more detail, more than happy to chat as well. Just finally, a thank you, and there's been a mountain of work in this space, especially the stuff around the NBO update. Genetic Evaluation Standing Committee, the team at DataGene and also Dairy Bio and others in putting all this together. Industry people that we've lent on, especially when it come to the economic modelling around the NBO changes, and the team at Abacus Bio that helped with a lot of the model creation and testing, and our friends at TMA who do a lot of the program heavy lifting in the background. So a lot of people involved in this, and we want to just thank them all. So with that, I'll try and work out how to stop sharing, which doesn't seem to. Oops, cancel that. My little shops. Here it is. It's because I'm looking at the wrong screen. There we go. So just on that, if anyone has got a question, by all means, shout out now. You take the opportunity now to ask a question. Otherwise, as I said, I'm more than happy to for you to contact us, myself, Pete, Twee, Leanne, or Laura, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. But if anyone's got a question now, shout out. Hang on, I can see in the chat. Yes, Lee's posted in the chat. For some of the changes and links, there's actually a ABV release update that's on the website, so you can get access to that. And there's a question from Majid that I need to probably take offline, because that might take a little while, that conversation, but I'll do that. Hillary's asked the question that she thought the HWI was going to be renamed. Is that still in the pipeline? No, we had quite a conversation around HWI and HWI as a brand. And there was a feeling that we should maybe change it to the seasonal index, but we felt that HWI was already out there as a brand, and we didn't want to go through a rebranding process with it. So we felt that we would stick with HWI rather than change it. Very good, guys. If there's no more questions, like I say, please reach out if you want if you want to have a chat or anything clarified. More than happy to do that. Otherwise, it's nearly 1 o'clock, so I might let you all go and look forward to an ABV release next week with no hiccups, hopefully. Thanks everyone for your time.